Croeso'r cynnes iawn I nôl I chi gyd I Marvel Moiders. My name is Dom. And if movies and comics are the dreaming of our collective unconsciousness, then Marvel Moiders is an attempt to interpret those dreams. And because no one really likes hearing interpretations of other people's dreams, and nobody really wants to have a conversations with me about Marvel, because I will moider endlessly, moider, Welsh word meaning to go on and on to the pain of others, then I've decided to dissipate my opinions across the internet like a noxious gas. And now in the third edition of Marvel Moiders, we are going to look at XMen, the 2000 film that was made by 20th Century Fox Studios. So, what do I know about the X-Men? Before I saw the film, when I was a kid, I read some of the 60s reprints of the X-Men comics, so the ones that had Beast and Cyclops and Iceman and Angel, the lesser spotted Angel, and Marvel Girl. Stan Lee basically invented the X-Men in the 60s all in one go as a group. He was getting tired of coming up with individual origin stories for his heroes, so he just wanted to have a group all in one go. They're all mutants. Let's press on. The 90s cartoon I didn't really watch, but you know, you pick up some stuff, and then there was just like the general cultural osmosis of absorbing bits and pieces about the X-Men. However, when we rolled around to the year 2000, having been a fan of the Batman franchise initially and a fan of the Superman franchise in the 70s, I was keen to see this movie, and I indeed found it to be great. I was quite relieved that they were taking the story seriously and it not being too kind of camp and snarky in the way that the Batman genre had kind of declined. There'd been a version of the X-Men cartoon in development since the mid-80s, but the feeling was now, with this X-Men film and it doing well, that superhero comic book movies had arrived. And Stan Lee got his first genuine comic book movie cameo. So, X-Men, I enjoyed it, but what happened? Well, there is an ensemble cast, but basically it's kind of three main characters. We get to see a quick version of the origin stories of Magneto, and Rogue, and and Wolverine is held up as a kind of romantic lead, which is maybe not really appropriate. He's maybe not the best fit for that, but I'll get onto that later. The film opens with a Star Trek style monologue about evolution and about biodiversity.
Mutation. It is the key to our evolution.
Patrick Stewart is the voice of Professor X, and he also, in his Picard guise, is the voice of optimism about humanity and the future. We go from this optimistic vision of evolution straight to a concentration camp, a Holocaust death camp. The young Magneto is discovering his powers to control metal while trying to keep hold of his parents. So we've gone from this optimism to Auschwitz. Serious stuff. Rogue's origin then comes up next, in the near future, as it says. And she's a young teen girl, and her powers come in and she finds she's suddenly draining the life force and powers from people with her touch. Unfortunately, her prospective boyfriend is the first to suffer this fate. And yes, she's a crazy freak. We then have a Senate hearing to set up the political context for the whole thing, about how the normies position mutants, and it's very kind of McCarthyist and plenty of paranoia and fear, all the kind of things we're used to xenophobic grifter politicians dealing in these days. And then a little bit later on, we meet Wolverine, who's working as a topless cage fighter in northern Canada. When Rogue meets him, he's an adamantium skeleton and a dearth of social skills. Magneto who is the baddie in this film, played by Ian McKellen, he plans to make the world safer for mutants by turning the world's elite into mutants. Various world leaders who are going to be meeting at this summit near the Statue of Liberty. His plan is to turn them into mutants using this machine that he's somewhat miraculously invented. And in doing so, make the world better for mutants, which seems naive at best. I think what would probably happen was if all the world leaders were turned into mutants, all the world leaders would get very swiftly replaced. So I don't think that's going to happen. Professor X and his protege XMen decide that they're going to stop him, predictably, and they do stop him. Yay! Magneto gets locked up in a plastic prison with a chess set for entertainment, and the good guys all repair to Professor X's X-Men school for mutants, and scene. But what about this title that I've arbitrarily given this? X-Men, The Rise of Feige, The Rise of Feige. Well, Kevin Feige, or Kevin Feige, depending what reality you prefer, was working on X-Men as an assistant to Lauren Shuler-Donner, who's the film producer extraordinaire. Her husband was the guy who directed the Superman films in the 70s. And he was at the very beginning of his career in his kind of assistant producer role. He was a recent convert to comics, and this Saint, or Marvel Comics specifically, and this Saint Paul-like zeal that he'd got from his conversion to comics kind of enabled him to develop, intentionally or not, a bit of a power base on the set of X-Men. He became the comics expert. He would kind of slip copies of X-Men comics to Hugh Jackman, and Hugh Jackman was trying to work out how to get his head around this Wolverine role. So this expertise meant that he was then became part of the nascent Marvel Studios, and his future as a comic book supremo was all but assured. Marvel Moiders is all about interpretation. It's all about working out, what do they mean? Why does this guy have wings? Why is this guy manipulating metal? Why do people want to go to the movies and watch it? Well, what is the X meaning of all this? Basically, and this will surprise few people, it's a film about difference, about kind of biodiversity, neurodiversity, diversity. It sets its stall out right at the beginning with this optimistic speech about evolution and also about the inevitability of evolution. So on the one hand, it's positive in that it's about not fitting into this cookie cutter idea of what normality is, but it's also saying this is going to keep happening, and the cookie cutter is going to be very busy cutting, because diversity is just what happens. Mutation is just what happens. Being a ADHD neurotype, I've always got my autism goggles on for things like this. Autism is, while it's viewed as a kind of a deficit and a disability, it's also viewed as a superpower sometimes in popular discourse, which is problematic in itself. So maybe that has some, that's reflected in what's going on in the X-Men film. It doesn't feel like it's a very good fit. So what are the other kind of paradigms that this might be describing? There's an academic called Ramsey Fawaz who described how superhero comics and films work as mirrors, that because they're not taken very seriously, where people unconsciously dump a lot of the political culture and a lot of these things that you can kind of then look on as a reflective surface. And superheroes' bodies as well, because they are unstable, effectively. They change, they mutate, they have powers, different things happen. This also suggests a kind of a pathway through to kind of what he calls bodily and psychic liberation, that, you know, this freedom of being different in our bodies, being gendered differently, thinking differently, and this kind of superheroes say this is possible. So what are the different kind of ways of looking at that? Race is a big one. Obviously, in the 1960s, when the X-Men comics were conceived, when they started to be written, the US was wrestling with its concepts of race, racism, getting rid of Jim Crow laws, and that framework worked very well with the X-Men, especially at the time. People have positioned Professor X, who is the good guy, if you like, Magneto, who is the maybe also a good guy, but in a more complicated way, positioned the two of them as kind of a Martin Luther King figure and a Malcolm X figure, with Magneto being more of a separatist and more insistent on by any means necessary, as Magneto says in this film, X-Men.
The war is still coming, Charles, and I intend to fight it. By any means necessary.
The way of going for mutant freedom, whereas the Professor X position is more about fitting in and more about finding a compromise. In one earlier version of the script, Magneto actually tries to create a mutant homeland on the island of Manhattan, which has maybe interesting parallels with Israel and these other post-traumatic colonial projects. There's this dialogue around Homo superior and the...
We are the future, Charles, not them.
The Homo sapiens is the past, which can be obviously scary, and it kind of plays into a lot of fears about replacement theory and all these kind of terrible ideas that we have rolling around at the moment. In terms of race as well, Halle Berry plays Storm, who is a African character who has the power to control weather. Is a very regal figure in the comics and in the cartoons, but in the films here she doesn't really have a lot to do. Angela Bassett was considered for the part earlier in the 90s when James Cameron and his then wife Catherine Bigelow were planning to do something with the X-Men films. Cameron producing, Bigelow directing. A Bigelow X-Men film would have been amazing. And Angela Bassett probably would have been a bit more regal, or would have been afforded more regal status in the film than Halle Berry, who was just kind of made to stand around and say slightly embarrassing lines about toads. Film opens after this speech with a scene from a Nazi death camp. This juxtaposition of the speech and the death camp kind of shows you that there are two very different visions of how these things resolve. Such a powerful opening, so powerful that they recreate it again at the beginning of the soft reboot of the X-Men films that they do with X-Men First Class, which is set in the 60s but starts in 1944 in this shot-for-shot scene. American comics in general have very much were rooted in the Jewish American imagination. Superman was the creation of Schuster and Siegel, who were two Jewish Americans, and Superman himself is a brilliant inversion of the Übermensch, this Nietzschean idea of just someone who's superior can do what the hell they want because they are inherently superior. Superman is saying, no, I'm going to look after the little people. The truth, justice, American way stuff, which is problematic, but not in that instance, I don't think. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were also Jewish Americans, so there's a very strong Jewish flavour, if you like, in the origin story of comics. Bryan Singer, the director, himself grew up in a Jewish household, and it was the themes of prejudice in the X-Men comics that he thought would be really spoke to him as an idea for a potential film. There's a broader political sense as well that we see in the Senate hearings, and the character of Senator Kelly could be identified as a McCarthyite, paranoid, when he's waving the lists around of people, these kind of black lists of mutants and everyone being registered. There's this McCarthyite enemy within thing going on. It also, though, speaks to the xenophobic grifters that we've got roaming around in our political landscape at the moment, who are talking about the enemy within. I don't need to name the names, we all know who they are. Magneto, in terms of xenophobia, tells us very pointedly that he arrived in America in 1949 as an immigrant, saw the Statue of Liberty and felt he was moving to a land of tolerance, and that dream had soured. Also, during that scene in the Senate, Senator Kelly makes this speech around, we don't know who's teaching our children, who are children going to be exposed to, these people with their secrets, what are they hiding? And it feels very much like what was going on in educational discourse at the time around people who were LGBTQ, and how could they have this influence corrupting our kids, which is still going on now, and has got worse in terms of the wokerati poisoning our kids' minds. So that broader kind of political sense of xenophobia as well. I like how the X-Men are offended by the bigoted nature of Senator Kelly's insinuations about, what are you hiding? What are people doing there? And I can just imagine them in there talking about it later, saying, can't believe what Senator Kelly was saying about us hiding things. Just wait till I get back to our secret base and I'll tell the professor and his mind control all about it. Hidden under a school, there to say Senator Kelly had a point. In terms of LGBTQI plus X, the fact that the powers come in with the onset of puberty means there's a big link to sexuality. Singer himself identified as bisexual, I think. Casting Ian McKellen as Magneto in this kind of freedom fighter role, if you like. McKellen himself has a long history of being a gay rights activist, and I guess LGBTQ in more recent times. In the X2 film, there's the line, one parent asks their kid they've just found out to be a mutant, have you tried not being a mutant? And that obviously really speaks to people who have been struggling with coming to terms with their sexuality. And also, have you tried not being autistic is also a thing. Bobby Drake, who is in the film briefly in the school, he's Iceman, has the power to control ice and kind of make things icy. Sounds pathetic, but he's an Omega level mutant. In the comics in 2015, it was decided that he would kind of retroactively come out as gay. He'd been very much a playboy character, kind of modeled on the Human Torch, but with cold instead of heat. He came out in the comics in 2015, so this is after this film. But you can see in Sean Ashmore's performance that the friendship he's offering Rogue seems to be almost like a platonic friendship rather than a romance somehow. It's complicated, but I can kind of read it that way quite easily. There's a darker side to this film as well, in that Bryan Singer has been has faced multiple accusations of sexual assault over the years. One of the actors in this film, a guy called Alex Burton, who plays Pyro in a really brief cameo, accused 3 men who were involved in the production of sexual assault. His assistant, David Hayter, ended up with the sole writing credit for X-Men, even though he'd very much just had the last kind of brush over the script. He had some positive influence in that he was fighting to make sure that Wolverine stayed Canadian, for example, rather than kind of changing his origins. But there was a lot of complicated situations going on around this as well. Whatever diversity prism you look at the X-Men through, there is a very real continuum between mutants or mutations that are almost invisible to kind of to patently obvious differences. This mirrors the ability of folk with different heritages, different sexualities, neurotypes, etc., to pass or to mask into the wider society or the narrower society in terms of its expectations. And within the film, the X-Men are much more about fitting in with society. They wear uniforms, they live and work in an institution, not unlike the kind of institutions where children may have been sent to be cured of like their sexuality or their neurodiversity. In terms of that school, looking at it briefly in terms of special educational needs, they seems to be pretty much just we'll teach these normal lessons about physics.
Physics.
Though I'm not really sure they were all paying attention in those physics classes.
Storm, fry 'em.
Oh, yes. A bolt of lightning into a huge copper conductor. I thought you lived at a school.
We won't really make any reasonable adjustments for people who have different needs. The general tone is much more one of acceptance rather than enabling and adapting to other people's needs, but maybe that's where we were 25 years ago, 26 years ago. The Brotherhood of the Mutants, on the other hand, are more grotesque, more colourful, less interested in conformity, so like Toad, Sabretooth. They share Penguin's contempt for the czars of fashion and conformity. The whole film is queasy about superheroes, and it kind of reflects a queasiness about difference and diversity. The kind of jokes in there about the costumes.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
The jokes about the code names.
What do they call you? Wheels?
Reflects the general tone, which is quite facetious and kind of a bit ironic, viewing things askance, really. Reflects the wariness of the film industry to go too weird, and I think that is less of a worry as we progress, through the rest of this century. Essentially, X-Men is a soap opera. It's something that the X-Men 97 animated series from a couple of years ago leans into really hard. The idea is just that you line up a load of sexually attractive actors and get them to argue and have affairs, and that's basically like your American-style soap opera.
Oh, and Logan, stay away from my girl.
In the cartoon, Rogue had, and in the comics, I think, Rogue had a big romance with a character called Gambit, but the film shifted her character into being a much younger girl, crushing on an older guy, on Wolverine, which again, in light of the alleged behaviour of Bryan Singer, is a bit uncomfortable. There's the love triangle of Jean Grey, played by Famke Janssen, who doesn't really come into her powers in a big way in this film, but will do later. Scott, who's played by James Marsden as a character called Cyclops, and Wolverine. So these three, Jean, Scott and Wolverine, this love triangle shifted towards the middle of the film, and very much in Wolverine's favour. Scott is a bit of a loser in this film.
Sorry?
And it's all kind of Wolverine and Jean cozying up. Having said that, James Marsden plays Scott, Cyclops, beautifully. He has loads of great lines and he delivers them brilliantly, in an understated but really good way. He has one of the few lines that survive from Joss Whedon's write-up of the script.
Hey, it's me.
Prove it.
You're a dick.
Okay.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing him appear in Avengers Doomsday, and hoping that he's going to be able to show a bit of that side of the character rather than just being the sad sack that he often appears to be in the films. Wolverine as Anchor Bean. There's a lot of love for Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, and I can understand it. But I'm not great with there being anchor beings, and I'm not great with everything being made about a particular character. I feel that way about Iron Man and Tony Stark and RDJ, and I definitely feel that way about Wolverine. Primarily, he's too good looking to be Wolverine. He's a romantic lead. He's a song and dance man apart from anything else, but he's a romantic lead, good looking guy. When James Cameron and Catherine Bigelow worked on a script in the early 90s, they were thinking of casting Bob Hoskins as Wolverine. in the comics and in the cartoons. Wolverine's kind of on the margins. He's definitely not romantic lead material, even though he really has romantic feelings. I think Bob Hoskins would have been an amazing Wolverine, but he's not a romantic lead, and Wolverine shouldn't be. Roy Thomas, who helped create Wolverine in the comics, almost called him Badger. Maybe that should have happened. Hugh Jackman himself got the wrong idea a bit about what Wolverine was, and was researching wolf behaviours for his performance until it was explained to him what a Wolverine actually was. Handsome and rangy as he was, Hugh Jackman only really started working out for the later films in earnest, possibly because he was the last minute replacement for the actor Dougray Scott, who I will always be a huge fan of for Twin Town, and who Tom Cruise wouldn't allow off the set of Mission Impossible 2 because he needed to get that finished. And the doors slid and Hugh Jackman was kind of put forward. But later on, he did become the huge jacked man that he's kind of known as now, and that would be in X2 and all the kind of films coming forward. But no, I'm not a fan of the Anchor Being, and I did feel as though the Wolverine character and all the films that came out with him in sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the X-Men as a whole. The other relationship I think people are really looking forward to seeing coming back in Doomsday is Magneto and Professor X, Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart. They're great lovey buddies, well through their 80s, almost to 90 now, both of them. The love they have for each other is really obvious, and it's a bubbly delight when you watch them on screen together. But while I think Patrick Stewart I think he was 60 or 59 maybe when he recorded, he's a splendid Xavier, I think. He's as solid as an oak table, his voice is oaken. But I'm not a massive fan of Ian McKellen's Magneto. And I think there's because this ironic detachment in his performance. I saw a video once with Richard Harris describing how there's a certain actor style which he feels doesn't really resonate with him when he's watching, and he named Ian McKellen as an example of that, and I kind of feel similar to my fellow Limerick-born man, Richard Harris. So yeah, there's that ironic detachment, whereas Michael Fassbender, he's got engagement for days. And I hope to see him back in that role sometime, although it seems a bit unlikely. His Magneto was brilliantly angry. I was struck when I was rewatching X-Men at the scene when Magneto freezes out Sabretooth, because Sabretooth has kind of let Senator Kelly slip through his grasp, and he closes the iron bars behind him and just walks away and leaves him there. I was struck by how similar approach to man management that is as Sir Alex Ferguson, the United coach, legend, manager. He used to ignore United players in training and in the corridors of the training complex if they had a poor performance the match before. And I had that feeling of just, you're dead to me now. Was really interesting. It then made me think, well, if he's Ferguson, then who's Professor X? And Arsene Wenger, who was like the Arsenal manager of some of Fergie's time at United, and was very urbane and thoughtful and seemed to have a really kindly relationship with his players. He could be Professor X. He looked like a school teacher, like a headmaster. Magneto could be Fergie. And then I thought, but wait, now we've got Pep Guardiola, who has a Professor X-like desire to control all of his young players and to get them to do exactly what he wants. He could be Professor X. And then maybe Jurgen Klopp, the former Liverpool manager, who was very much like Guardiola's rival, he and his love for heavy metal football could be Magneto.
I like heavy metal more.
And I really like that idea. I'm running with that. Heated rivalries, indeed. And to take it back to the rise of Kevin Feige again, maybe he is the Professor X of this scenario, and his rise through the Marvel ranks has been some sinister mind control operation. Who knows? What are my likes and dislikes? Like I said, I really liked the film when it came out. I thought it was a relief to see superhero films treated in a way that wasn't just a piss take. I liked the dialogue. There's loads of lines and I love it. They're quite low key, but when Wolverine goes into Cerebro, which is this big machine that Professor X uses to locate mutants, and says,
"It certainly is a big round room."
There's a dryness there that I really like. Not the full-on Tony Snark MCU stuff.
You don't like him?
How could you tell?
Well, I am psychic, you know.
But a similar kind of thing, and I really like it.
You were attacked. My people brought you here for medical attention.
I don't need medical attention.
Yes, of course.
Of course. Of course.
I liked that realism. The trailer for X-Men really leaned into the whole Matrix thing, you know, the black leather suits, really leaned into it. And I think, yeah, I enjoyed all that kind of side of it as well. I liked Sabretooth's look, even though I think Liv Schreiber did a better job of the character and being kind of Wolverine, thorn in Wolverine's side, and this horrible big brother energy that he has. I like the fact that I hadn't realised this, but Magneto's helmet blocking Professor X's mental controls was invented in this film, I think, and then became introduced in the comics. Up to that point, I think there'd been some kind of gentleman's agreement that Professor X wouldn't control Magneto's mind, which again seems a bit naive, but I like the fact that the helmet was contributed by the film to the lore of the X-Men. What I didn't like about it, the tone of it now does seem a bit muted and a bit queasy, like I said, about kind of superhero stuff. I like the fact that it's a bit more out there now. I'm not bothered about the uniforms, this kind of thing of, oh, they should have been wearing the spandex. You know, no, it would have been wrong. It was good that they kind of leapfrogged on the Blade and the Matrix and that kind of zeitgeist to make it a bit more acceptable. It would have looked daft. It would have looked like a Joel Schumacher film. Batman Forever. We don't want that, Batman and Robin. So it's good that didn't happen, but it has kind of aged a bit now, and looking back on it, everyone does seem a bit normal to be mutants, especially on the X-Men side. Also, chess. Please stop using chess as shorthand for geniuses. I don't like it. It's a boring trope. Even though chess experts have looked at the game that they were playing in the plastic prison at the end, and how Charles is using a strategy where you sacrifice pawns, which seems to be the exact opposite of what he's saying throughout the film, but you can kind of look for things that maybe he's not as much about everybody getting out of here alive as he would maintain. So yeah, no more chess please, but unfortunately the X-Men films is going to have chess all over them. I just have to deal with it. So that's X-Men. There's been research that suggests that the trauma that follows from oppression, like the Holocaust and other things, has an effect on the body at a cellular level. And I like how that cellular effect of oppression fits in with the X-Men, and the X-Men rising as a response to that kind of oppressive attempt to control things. The mutations in the X-Men, the characters often find their powers through periods of great stress, and it's justice really for people who don't fit the straight white male hetero cis cookie cutter. That's probably something we need more than ever now, and maybe there's some genes out there that are being changed at a molecular level by the stresses and the injustices that they're facing. Maybe we've got a Magneto that's somewhere in America that's going to end up leaving and arriving in a new continent, leave the Statue of Liberty behind in 2049 and go somewhere else. Let's see. Xavier suggests when they have a conversation, he and Magneto right at the beginning of the film, that mankind has evolved since the Second World War. And Magneto kind of rather neatly says, yes, into us. But maybe in the last 26 years, mankind has devolved and regressed a bit. So that's a bit painful watching that now, that kind of smuggish optimism about human beings. It's like, maybe not quite so much. So next time, I'm going to follow James Cameron's example, and I'm going to switch my attention from X-Men to the first Spider-Man film. The first Spider-Man film of many. So take care, my biodiverse siblings, and I'll see you further on downstream.